6 Iranian gunboats, armed with 50 caliber machine guns, closed in on a 200-meter American oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz and ordered the captain to stop his engines and prepare to be boarded. The tanker didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It did the exact opposite, and within minutes, an American guided missile destroyer was racing to the scene with air support already inbound. No shots were fired. No one was hurt. And by the time it was over, Iran's entire attempt to seize an American-flagged ship had collapsed without a single casualty on either side. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why the tanker's decision not to stop was actually the smartest possible move available, and how the U.S. Navy's response turned a potential hostage crisis into a textbook example of exactly how this kind of confrontation is supposed to go. Let's start with the facts, because this incident is unusually well documented across multiple independent sources. On Tuesday, February 3rd, 2026, the U.S.-flagged tanker Stena Imperative was transiting the inbound traffic separation scheme of the Strait of Hormuz, roughly 16 nautical miles north of Oman's coast, according to the British maritime security firm Vanguard Tech, and confirmed separately by the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center. 6 small armed boats belonging to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, described by Seat Raid Maritime as arranged in 3 pairs and fitted with 50 caliber weapons, approached the tanker at high speed. According to CBS News, the gunboats hailed the tanker over VHF radio and ordered the captain to stop the engines and prepare to be boarded. U.S. Central Command's own statement provided to Lloyd's List added a critical detail. 2 of those IRGC boats and an Iranian Mohider surveillance drone approached the tanker at high speeds and specifically threatened to board and seize the vessel. Here's the moment that actually decided the entire outcome of this confrontation. Instead of complying, the Stena Imperative's captain increased speed and maintained course. Vanguard Tech, the security firm monitoring the vessel, specifically stressed that the ship never entered Iranian territorial waters at any point during the encounter, staying instead within the boundaries of Oman's exclusive economic zone, as confirmed by marine traffic tracking data. That single decision, refusing to stop while also staying scrupulously within international and Omani waters, turned out to be the entire key to how this situation resolved. It's worth understanding where this tanker was actually headed, because the destination itself connects directly to why American naval assets were positioned closely enough to respond so quickly. The Stena Imperative was bound for the port of Sitra in Bahrain, according to CBS News tracking of the vessel, with an expected arrival date of February 5th. Bahrain isn't just any port in the region. It's home to the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet, the command responsible for naval operations across the entire Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, the Red Sea, and the wider surrounding waters. A tanker transiting the Strait of Hormuz on a course toward Bahrain was, by definition, operating well within the operational heartland of American naval presence in the region, which is a meaningful part of why a guided missile destroyer happened to be close enough to respond to the gunboat confrontation within a genuinely short window. That's not a coincidence born from lucky timing alone. It's a reflection of just how concentrated American naval power already was, around the exact corridor connecting the Strait of Hormuz to Bahrain, during this period of heightened tension. Let's talk about why that specific response actually qualifies as the smart play here, because it's not obvious at first glance. When 6 armed boats surround your ship and tell you to stop, the intuitive human reaction might be to comply, to avoid provoking further escalation. But think through what actually happens if a 200-meter tanker stops dead in the water in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. It becomes an entirely stationary target, easy to board, easy to seize, and once Iranian personnel are physically on deck, the entire legal and tactical picture changes instantly. A moving vessel, even one being approached by fast boats, is far harder to board safely, small craft attempting to pull alongside a large tanker underway at speed risk, their own boats being swamped or damaged in the tanker's wake, and any boarding attempt against a non-compliant moving vessel is inherently more dangerous and less certain to succeed than one against a ship that's already stopped and sitting still. The captain's decision to increase speed rather than comply wasn't panic or defiance for its own sake. It was a calculated bet that staying in motion bought time, and that time was exactly what the situation needed. And that bet paid off almost immediately, because staying in motion and staying out of Iranian territorial waters meant the tanker never gave Iran a legal pretext to claim the situation differently, and it bought just enough time for American naval forces to respond. According to CENTCOM spokesman Captain Tim Hawkins, speaking directly to Lloyd's List, the guided missile destroyer USS McFaul, hull number DDGS-74, was already operating in the area and immediately responded to the scene to escort Stena Imperative, providing defensive air support from the U.S. Air Force at the same time. Hawkins put the outcome plainly: the situation de-escalated as a result, and the U.S. flag tanker is proceeding safely. That's the entire resolution, right there, in a single sentence from the American military's own on-record statement: no engagement, no casualties, Just a rapid, credible show of force that made the Iranian gunboats break off. It's worth pausing on the Mohajer drone specifically, because its presence in this encounter adds an important layer most casual coverage of the incident glossed over. The Mohajer series represents one of Iran's longer-running domestically produced unmanned aircraft programs, used across a range of roles from surveillance to, in some configurations, direct strikes. Its presence alongside the gunboats during the Stena Imperative encounter suggests this wasn't simply 6 boats acting independently. It was a coordinated approach combining surface craft with aerial reconnaissance, likely intended to help the gunboats track the tanker's exact position, speed, and heading in real time as they closed in. That's a more sophisticated operational picture than 6 boats alone would suggest, and it's part of why American forces treated the incident seriously enough to scramble both a destroyer and Air Force air support rather than simply monitoring the situation from a distance. Coordinated drone and boat operations like this one have become a recurring feature of Iran's approach to contesting the Strait of Hormuz throughout this entire war, and the Stena Imperative encounter was an early, clearly documented example of exactly that combined tactic in action. Let's talk about the USS McFaul specifically, because understanding what that ship actually brought to the encounter helps explain why Iran's gunboats backed away so quickly once it arrived. An Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer like the McFaul carries an Aegis combat system, vertical launch missile cells capable of engaging both surface and air threats, and a 5-inch deck gun, along with close-in weapons systems specifically designed for exactly this kind of small boat threat. 6 IRGC fast boats armed with 50 caliber machine guns represent a genuine, serious threat to an unescorted, unarmed civilian tanker, against a warship purpose-built to detect, track, and if necessary, destroy exactly that kind of small boat swarm. Backed by combat aircraft already vectoring in for defensive air support, that same threat becomes something an Iranian commander on the water has to think very carefully about actually following through on. The math changes entirely once a destroyer that size is on scene, and Iranian forces appear to have recognized that shift in real time and chosen to disengage rather than escalate further. It's worth understanding how an incident like this actually gets documented and verified in the first place, because it involves an entire layer of private maritime security infrastructure most people never think about. Firms like Vanguard Tech and the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre exist specifically to monitor exactly this kind of encounter in real time, tracking vessel positions, relaying distress calls, and issuing advisories to the thousands of commercial ships transiting contested waters like the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Without that layer of independent, commercially funded monitoring, incidents like the Stena Imperative confrontation might never receive the kind of detailed, near real-time public reporting that let outlets like CBS News, Lloyd's List, and Seat Raid Maritime piece together exactly what happened within hours of the actual event. That's part of why this specific incident is so well documented compared to some other encounters. In the same war, multiple independent commercial and governmental sources were actively tracking the exact same vessel in the exact same waters at the exact same time, producing overlapping, cross-verifiable accounts rather than relying on a single source's version of events. It's worth understanding the broader context this incident was unfolding inside, because it wasn't happening in isolation. According to Lloyd's List, the Stena Imperative encounter wasn't even the only point of friction between the US and Iran that same Tuesday. Hours before the tanker was approached, a US fighter jet shot down an Iranian drone in the Arabian Sea after it had aggressively approached the aircraft carrier, USS Abraham Lincoln, while the carrier was transiting the region. That's 2 separate incidents, a drone shot down near a carrier and gunboats confronting a tanker, happening on the same day in the same broader theater, at a moment when American and Iranian forces were operating in extremely close proximity across the entire Gulf region. The Jerusalem Post's analysis of the episode captured the significance well, noting that the U.S. Navy and U.S. vessels appeared to have learned lessons from past encounters, with the tanker successfully preventing itself from being hijacked by Iranian fast boats through speed and positioning, while American forces simultaneously demonstrated they'd respond decisively to any direct threat against a carrier as well. It's worth understanding exactly what was driving tensions to this level in the first place, because the Stena Imperative encounter didn't happen against a neutral political backdrop. Iran had spent the preceding weeks in the grip of a violent internal crackdown on protests, unrest that human rights organizations would later say resulted in thousands of deaths and tens of thousands of detentions across the country. The USS Abraham Lincoln's deployment to the region, which put American naval assets close enough to respond to the Stena Imperative encounter within such a short window, was originally framed in part as a signal of support to Iranian protesters facing that crackdown, according to reporting from The Conversation. That means the entire naval posture that ultimately protected the Stena Imperative wasn't purely about commercial shipping security in the abstract. It was tied directly to a much broader American response to Iran's internal political turmoil, playing out in real time just weeks before Operation Epic Fury and the wider war that followed. Now, let's put this incident inside the timeline of everything that was happening around it, because the Stena Imperative confrontation arrived at a genuinely pivotal moment. This happened just days ahead of expected negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, according to CBS News' own reporting at the time, with tensions already running high as the United States increased its naval presence in the region. A senior Iranian official from the Revolutionary Guard's naval forces had threatened just the week before to block passage through the strait entirely in the event of a U.S. attack. The Guard had held military exercises in the strategic waterway over the preceding weekend. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group had deployed to the region specifically amid concerns over Iran's internal political repression and broader regional destabilization, according to G Captain's detailed reporting on the episode, meaning the entire Gulf was already primed for exactly this kind of confrontation before the Stena Imperative ever entered the strait. There's a detail from G Captain's reporting that adds real nuance to how this incident was received by the broader shipping industry, and it's worth including because it complicates the purely triumphant version of this story. For ship operators and insurers, one of the most contentious aspects of the entire episode was the perception that the Stena Imperative was not actually under close naval escort at the time of the initial approach, despite other commercial vessels reportedly receiving heightened protection during that same period. That's an important caveat. The successful outcome here wasn't purely a case of flawless, prepositioned American naval protection working exactly as designed from the start. It was, at least in part, a tanker captain making the right call under pressure, buying enough time for naval support that arrived only after the confrontation had already begun, rather than being present from the outset. That distinction matters for anyone drawing lessons from this episode about how well protected American-flagged shipping actually was in the Strait during this period. It's worth taking seriously the specific warning Iranian officials had issued just days before this encounter, because it shows the Stena Imperative confrontation wasn't a spontaneous, unplanned event on Iran's side. A senior Iranian official from the Revolutionary Guard's naval forces had explicitly threatened, the week before, to block passage through the strait entirely in the event of a U.S. attack, according to Al Arabiya's reporting from that period. The Guard had also held military exercises in the strait over the preceding weekend, a fairly standard signal of readiness and resolve ahead of a period of heightened diplomatic tension. Right against that backdrop, the gunboats approaching the Stena Imperative on February 3rd look less like an isolated opportunistic incident and more like a deliberate test of exactly how the United States would respond to a real, if limited, challenge to freedom of navigation in the strait, timed specifically in the days before expected negotiations between the two countries. That's an important piece of context for understanding why the American response mattered so much diplomatically as well as tactically. A weak or slow response here could have signaled to Iran that similar, larger provocations might succeed as negotiations approached, while the actual outcome, a fast, credible naval response that caused Iran's boats to break off without incident, sent the opposite signal instead. Let's talk about the broader pattern this specific incident fits inside, because Iran's use of small, fast, armed boats to threaten commercial shipping wasn't a one-time tactic invented for this particular encounter. This is a doctrine Iran has relied on for years, built around exactly the kind of asymmetric threat 650 caliber armed gunboats represent against a much larger, more expensive, and inherently less maneuverable commercial vessel. The Strait of Hormuz itself is barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, according to Army recognitions later reporting on a separate incident in the strait, with separated shipping lanes that constrain how much room a large tanker actually has to maneuver, and vessels exceeding 250 meters in length powered by low-speed diesel engines optimized for fuel efficiency and endurance rather than acceleration or agility face a genuine imbalance when confronted by fast attack craft capable of exceeding 40 knots. That imbalance is exactly what Iran's entire small boat strategy in the strait has always been built to exploit. And it's exactly what the Stena Imperative's captain had to overcome in real time, using nothing more than his ship's own speed and a refusal to comply, until American naval support could actually arrive on scene. It's also worth understanding how this specific encounter compares to what happened later in the war, because the Stena Imperative incident, as tense as it was, actually represents one of the better possible outcomes in a string of similar confrontations that followed. Roughly 11 weeks later, on April 18, 2026, according to armies, recognition and the Associated Press, Iranian gunboats actually opened fire on a different tanker transiting the strait, this time bypassing standard VHF communication procedures entirely before engaging, a deliberate departure from the graduated warning sequence that had at least nominally been followed during the Stena Imperative encounter back in February. UKMTO reported the tanker and crew as safe in that later incident, but tanker trackers Com reported that multiple vessels, including an Indian-flagged supertanker, were forced to turn around in the strait after being fired on. That escalation, from gunboats hailing a ship by radio and threatening to board it in February, to gunboats opening fire without any warning at all by April, shows just how much the security environment in the strait deteriorated over the following weeks as this war intensified. The Stena Imperative's captain and the American destroyer that came to his aid were operating in a genuinely dangerous window. But by the standards of what came later in the same conflict, February 3rd still counts as one of the more controlled, better resolved encounters in the entire campaign. Let's also talk about the tanker herself for a moment, because the Stena Imperative wasn't a random commercial vessel caught up in this by accident. According to Strait Maritime, the ship, built in 2016, is part of the U.S. Maritime Administration's Tanker Security Program, a government initiative specifically designed to maintain a fleet of U.S.-flagged commercial tankers available to support national security needs during a crisis. That's a meaningful detail. This wasn't simply an American company's commercial asset that happened to be transiting the strait at the wrong moment. It was a vessel specifically enrolled in a federal program built around exactly this kind of scenario. A tanker whose crew and operator likely had some level of additional training and awareness around the possibility of exactly this kind of confrontation happening in contested waters. That context doesn't diminish the tension of the actual encounter, but it does help explain why the response, refuse to comply, maintain speed, stay in safe waters, report through established security channels, unfolded with the kind of discipline that it did. It's worth understanding a bit more about the tanker security program itself, because it's a genuinely important piece of American maritime strategy that most people have never heard of. The program exists specifically to ensure the United States maintains access to a fleet of privately owned, U.S.-flagged tankers that can be called upon to support military and national security needs during a crisis, precisely the kind of scenario this entire war represents. Vessels enrolled in the program receive certain government incentives in exchange for maintaining U.S. registry and remaining available for exactly this kind of contingency use. That arrangement means a ship like the Stena Imperative occupies a genuinely unusual position. Technically, a commercial vessel engaged in ordinary oil transport, but simultaneously part of a strategic reserve the American government specifically maintains for moments of exactly this kind of tension. When gunboats approached that ship and threatened to seize it, they weren't just threatening a private company's commercial asset. They were testing America's willingness to defend a vessel that forms part of its own strategic sea lift and logistics planning, which likely raised the stakes on the American side well beyond what an ordinary commercial tanker incident might have warranted. I want to be honest about what remains uncertain in this story too, the same way I try to be with every video like this. Iranian officials, according to reporting from Port News, later characterized the incident differently, saying a vessel had entered territorial waters without permits and departed after being warned without describing any further security consequences, a version of events that directly contradicts Vanguard Tech's own tracking data and its explicit statement that the Stena Imperative never entered Iranian territorial waters at all. That's a genuine discrepancy between the two sides' accounts, and I want you to know that discrepancy exists, rather than presenting only the American and commercial industry version of events as the unquestioned final word. What is corroborated across multiple independent outlets, CBS News, Lloyd's List, Strait Maritime, G-Captain, and CENTCOM's own on-record statement, is the core sequence of events: gunboats approached and threatened to board, the tanker didn't stop, and a U.S. destroyer arrived to escort it to safety without any shots being fired by either side. It's worth understanding how this specific incident rippled outward into the maritime insurance industry, because that's often where the real, longer-lasting consequences of an event like this actually show up. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz are set by underwriters who track exactly this kind of confrontation closely, adjusting rates based on the frequency and severity of incidents like the Stena Imperative encounter. A gunboat confrontation that resolves without any shots fired and with a rapid, effective naval response tends to be read differently by underwriters than one involving actual gunfire or a successful boarding would be, which is part of why the distinction between this February encounter and the actual gunfire reported in April carries real economic weight beyond just the immediate safety of the crews involved. Higher war risk premiums get passed down through shipping costs, insurance costs, and ultimately fuel and consumer prices far beyond the Gulf region itself, meaning even a successfully resolved confrontation like the Stena Imperative incident still carries an economic signal that ripples out through global trade well beyond the relatively contained, seemingly successful outcome on the water that day. Let's zoom out and think about what this specific episode actually tells us about how this kind of maritime confrontation gets managed in practice, because it's a genuinely useful case study. The entire incident, from the moment the gunboats first hailed the tanker to the moment the USS McFaul arrived and the Iranian boats broke off, appears to have unfolded over a relatively short window, likely well under an hour based on the available reporting, even though the tanker was transiting an area roughly 16 nautical miles from the Omani coast, meaning American naval assets had to already be reasonably close by in order to respond as quickly as they did. That's a reminder of just how much of America's presence in the Strait of Hormuz throughout this period was about exactly this kind of readiness, warships positioned and postured specifically to respond within minutes to exactly this category of threat. Because the alternative, a fully successful Iranian seizure of an American-flagged tanker and its crew, would have represented an enormously serious escalation with consequences far beyond a single ship and a single crew. It's worth remembering, before we get to the final takeaway, that behind every one of these tense encounters sits a merchant crew doing an inherently risky job that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The men and women aboard the Stena Imperative that day were civilian mariners, not military personnel, tasked with keeping a 200-meter tanker moving safely through one of the most contested stretches of water on the planet, while armed boats closed in around them. Commercial shipping crews transiting the Strait of Hormuz throughout this entire war have had to make exactly these kinds of split-second judgment calls, often with far less institutional support and far less certainty about how quickly help might actually arrive than the Stena Imperative ultimately received. That's worth keeping in view whenever a story like this gets told as a clean tactical success, because the actual experience for the people on that ship, in the moments before anyone knew a destroyer was inbound, was almost certainly a great deal more frightening and uncertain than the eventual, well-documented outcome makes it sound in hindsight. So here's the actual answer to why this response counts as genuinely smart tactical thinking rather than just a lucky outcome. The tanker's captain made a decision, under real pressure, with 6 armed boats and a drone closing in, to trust that speed and legal positioning mattered more than immediate compliance, and that decision bought exactly the time needed for American naval power to arrive and change the entire calculation for the Iranian boats on scene. The U.S. Navy, for its part, had a destroyer close enough and ready enough to actually deliver on that bet, arriving with both surface combat capability and coordinated air support fast enough to make continuing the confrontation look like a losing proposition for the IRGC boats involved. Neither side fired a shot. Nobody was hurt. And an American-flagged tanker enrolled specifically in a federal program built around exactly this kind of crisis made it safely to Bahrain days later, arriving at the port of Sitra on February 5th, as originally scheduled, according to CBS News' tracking of the vessel's onward journey. It's worth closing out the diplomatic thread here, because the timing detail mentioned earlier deserves one more look. This entire confrontation played out just days ahead of expected negotiations between Washington and Tehran, according to CBS News' own framing of the incident at the time. Whatever the negotiators on either side ultimately said behind closed doors in the days that followed, both governments went into that diplomatic window having just watched, in close to real time, exactly how the other side would behave when a genuinely tense, high-stakes maritime confrontation actually occurred. Iran watched the United States respond within minutes with a guided missile destroyer and Air Force support. The United States watched Iran deploy 6 armed boats and a surveillance drone against an unarmed commercial tanker enrolled in its own strategic reserve program. Neither side could have walked away from that specific Tuesday without a clearer, harder-edged sense of where the other's actual red lines and actual response times sat, information that almost certainly shaped how both delegations approached the negotiating table only days later. Every figure and claim in this video comes from named, on-the-record reporting, CENTCOM's own confirmed statement through spokesman Captain Tim Hawkins, the maritime security firm Vanguard Tech's on-scene reporting, UK Maritime Trade, Operations Official Advisory, and coverage from CBS News, Lloyd's List, Seat Raid Maritime, G-Captain, the Jerusalem Post, Port News, and Army recognitions, later reporting on how the broader security situation in the Strait evolved in the weeks that followed. Where Iranian and American or commercial accounts of the incident diverge, specifically around whether the tanker entered Iranian territorial waters. I've told you that explicitly because that disagreement is a real documented part of this story, rather than something to smooth over for a cleaner narrative. There's a final practical lesson buried in this story that's worth carrying forward, regardless of which interpretation you land on. Every commercial vessel transiting the Strait of Hormuz throughout this war has had to weigh the exact same trade-off the Stena Imperative's captain faced that Tuesday. Comply immediately with an armed demand to stop, or trust that maintaining speed and staying within clearly defensible internationally recognized waters buys enough time for help to actually arrive. That's not a decision any merchant captain should have to make lightly. And the fact that it worked out well for the Stena Imperative doesn't guarantee the same choice would produce the same outcome for the next vessel facing a similar approach, especially given how much more aggressive Iran's tactics became by the time gunboats opened fire without warning just 11 weeks later in April. So here's my question for you. Given that this specific confrontation resolved without a single shot fired, largely because a tanker captain refused to stop And an American destroyer arrived fast enough to make continuing the standoff too risky for Iran's gunboats. Do you think that outcome reflects genuinely smart, well-drilled American naval readiness in the Gulf? Or does it reflect Iran testing the waters with a deliberately limited, reversible provocation that was never actually intended to end in a real seizure in the first place? Either way, this specific Tuesday in early February stands as one of the clearest, most thoroughly documented examples in this entire war of exactly how close ordinary commercial shipping came to a real crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, and exactly how much depended on split-second decisions made by people who never expected to be tested that particular morning. Let me know where you land on this in the comments. I read every single one of them. Thanks so much for watching this full breakdown, and I'll see you in the next one.